In today's video, we are going to cover the Bosch RA1054 Deluxe Router Guide, aka Edge Guide and Circle Cutter. As a kit, this costs about $35 to $37 US, not including shipping, taxes, anything other added on. It fits the 1617 and Bosch's other large router. This is not for the trim router. It will not fit the Colt that has its own Edge Guide. If you are just looking for a quick, how do you rate this, should you buy it? For me, this is a 7 out of 10. And that is only because it is one of my most used accessories and one that I wish could be upgraded on the most. If you need an Edge Guide and you have the Bosch router, this is, for the price range, really your only main option. There are a few others that don't seem to be an obvious upgrade. If you are buying this as a circle cutter, I highly suggest you get an actual designed circle cutter, and I will include a few links in the description to more specific purpose-made circle cutters. Now, in the box, you get the Edge Guide, which also contains the Circle Cutting Guide, which is this piece right here, but is used for the micro adjust on the Edge Guide, the pivot point for cutting circles, and this little dust collection nozzle hose thing, and comes with this fitting as well. So let's begin with the good. The first thing is the cost. At $35 to use an Edge Guide and a circle cutter, that's a really enticing price. It's relatively well made. This is aluminum. This is some kind of metal, heavier, maybe steel, not sure. And then thicker plastic for any of the plastic parts. It holds up very well. Like I said, I use this all the time. This is relatively thick plastic. This is some kind of, it's not a rubber, but it's another type of plastic and metal. It's not going to get damaged easily. So at $35, the quality is pretty good just for the parts themselves. The next upside is adjustability. We've got a micro adjust, which works pretty well. I'll discuss that a little more in the cons. These bars are able to be adjusted if you're working in a certain tight space. The reference guides can be adjusted further out or closer in depending upon the size of your workpiece. And overall, there's just a good amount of holding power and surface contact points where you need surface, whether it's clamping down on these or on the reference for your board. So let's talk a little bit about the dimensions that you can make the cuts. For using the Edge Guide, you can get obviously a minimum of 0 right into your board, or a maximum of about 9 inches between the reference surface here and the farthest out that you can put your cutting bit if you are clamping on just the end of this and just the end of the bars on either side. So about 9 inches at the maximum that you really want to push this thing. For the circle cutting part, if you wish to push it to the absolute max, you're looking at a radius of about 15 inches from the center of this pivot point, which is where this will go. If you bring this all the way back on these bars and you put your router all the way out on the other end of the bars, so a diameter of about 30 inches. Not huge, but not too small either. And minimum wise, you're looking at maybe 3 inches, awkwardly 3 to 4 inches if you were to bring it all the way in. Not really ideal for cutting extremely small circles because of the size of the overall router, but it can do relatively small ones if you must. We'll now touch on the downsides. The first one is this dust collection, which in my opinion is essentially useless. The starting thing is to get this to a 2.5 inch hose, you have to add adapters all the way out to here. I could not find something that fit directly from this to 2.5 that was not in some kind of kit that was expensive. So for me to get this to a 2.5, which chokes down for my dust collector, I have to have this gigantic thing hanging over. Now the way this works is that on the underside, you have these 2 bolts that stick through from how the reference faces of the Edge Guide are connected, and this sits down in here like this. Hanging off the bottom, hose goes in, flip it over. Now I'm sure you can see one of the problems already. This is open down here and is set all the way back here. So to get dust to this point, if you are cutting anywhere out here, it has to somehow be thrown over here with enough suction where you also have this open gap under here in case you're cutting something very close to then get pulled down. Now, anyone who has used a router knows that a router spins in 360 degrees and throws dust in 360 degrees. Anywhere other than cutting nearly directly over top of it or very close, and this does next to nothing. I honestly wish they had just taken $5 off the price and not included this. I have never used it other than the very first time I used it, in part because you have this gigantic thing hanging off the side, and on a hose, It's very awkward. It doesn't work well either as a dust collection for close in or far out. Just a total mess and not a great design. If Bosch wants dust collection, build it into the router base like Festool. The next downside is the machining tolerances on this. Now on a $35 piece of equipment, you can't expect too much. But these two Edge, I'll call them spanners, do not sit perfectly flush. We'll see if you can hear this. I'm hoping you can hear that and perhaps see that. Right in the middle, these are not meeting flush, and it is tilting a little bit. Now, because a router cuts at a central point, unlike a table saw, which is directional, you can sort of get around this by referencing off of the same point through the entire cut. Like I said, I use this all the time. The results on stop grooves, which is mainly what I use it for, is fine. I'm happy with that, but it is a little annoying and it's going to be a problem if for some reason you need these to be perfectly flush for your cut. They simply aren't, and I assume that's simply due to the machining tolerances of this entire piece. Now, for most people, you will be using this with the plunge base, and it slides into the fixed base as well just fine through these two areas, locks here, and it holds very well. It does not move anywhere. One of the immediate problems, and this is not really Bosch's fault, but it's just something annoying, is when you are not using it, maybe you need to adjust something elsewhere and you set it down, it places all the pressure on these bars. For long sessions when I'm using this, I actually built this little block here, just screwed together some wood to hold it at an even level so that there's not a bunch of pressure placed on these bars. Not Bosch's fault, but just a slight annoyance. The next two downsides are that if you want to have the wood on the table fully, you are going to need to work with something over 1 inch in height. This board is about 1 inch and it is just barely not touching the table too much to ruin this. If you're using a 3/4 inch piece of wood, you will have to hang this over the sides or use something like bench cookies or something else to lift the wood off of the surface. And that may be fine for you, but for me, I generally have to hang the piece of wood over the side because I don't have any easy, quickly storable way to elevate entire pieces of wood whenever I want to use this. Now, going in the opposite direction of size, you must use a piece that is over 1/2 inch because you'll notice the gap between the top of this and where the router base sits. Anything smaller and the wood will just not make contact and will slide right back. So it's really made for, over 1/2 inch and up in general, just to be able to use this, and something that needs to be 1 inch, a little over 1 inch or taller, or else you either have to elevate the wood itself or hang the wood over the edge of the table. Up next, we have the micro adjust, which works well and also has some serious flaws. Now, to use the micro adjust, you obviously have to have it locked into your initial base. You then undo these two screws and you can twist it to the right to move the router deeper in and to the left to pull the router out. Now, I'm sure you've just seen the problem right there. This, to hold still, needs to have positive tension at all times. If you undo this and any vibration has loosened this back, this has no counter spring to hold this in. It will snap all the way back to where this then applies positive pressure, which is a really big problem if you are micro adjusting back and forth. So whenever you're using this, before you undo these two, make sure there is positive pressure placed on those springs and that this is not loose at all, or else you will lose your place and it defeats the entire purpose of the micro adjust, because like I said, there is nothing that stops this from just spinning all the way out. On the plus side for the micro adjust, you've actually got pretty good range, over 1 inch or so, I would say, based on using it. And you've also got this movable dial so that you can zero it in at the point of cut and then undo it. Again, make sure you've got positive tension. And then let's say you just wanted to move 1/64th. You've got it 1/64th and it's locked in. And this is calibrated to the threads of the screw to know that you're 1/64th forward in that case. So very handy when it works well. If you ever do not have positive pressure on this and you loosen these, you can see it just all the way move. It will totally take your place away. All right, I'd like to now touch on the circle cutting aspect. You will need your pivot point, and then to turn this into the circle cutter, we need to remove this front part as well as these springs. Now, the easiest way to do that is to take this all the way out because we will not need this. You will then loosen these two, remove this, remove these two springs, and do not lose these. And this is essentially your circle cutter. Now, one of the big problems with this is that unlike many other ones where you do need to put a hole into the wood, whether underside or topside, this does not use that. So this saves you from having a hole either drilled or nailed or something like that in there, which in some cases can be very useful. However, to hold this down, and you'll see this in the testing footage later, you have to tape this, glue this, somehow affix this. And it is not perfect. It is not perfect using duct tape. It will occasionally move on you. And if it moves once, because there is nothing connecting it down, you have lost your center point, and it is totally done so. And the way this works is you've got this glued down. This just sits on here, attached to your router like so, and it pivots around this central point. But again, it all relies on affixing this to the workpiece. So there's also just a tiny little bit of play in this hole and in here, and I understand it can't be a perfect fit because we don't want friction stopping it from turning, but just a tiny bit of play. So not something that'll be visible to the eye too obviously. If it does move a little bit. To reassemble this from the circle cutter guide mode, you simply apply the springs back onto here. You will insert this through here. We'll then slide both pegs back through there, and then you will just screw this in through here. Tighten these down, and you are back to your edge guide system. We will now go into the testing of the edge guide itself, and I'm going to show you the thing that I use this for the most, and that's putting lids floating into the bottom of boxes. Now, box joints, I have here an example of doing it on a table saw, and you can see you come right through the end of the box joint. Well, aesthetically that's terrible. You can try to plug that. It never looks great. So instead, one of the easiest things to do is get the router out and do a plunged stopped groove, meaning you stop before the box joints. So I'm just going to show you that and show you how the edge guide performs doing that. So I've laid out here a hypothetical box and to do a groove on. Now normally this would only be this tall, this is where it would end, so relatively narrow. And we've got the box joints drawn in here, and I want to remove this area between them, stopping before the box joint so I can float a lid on the bottom there. So what we'll do is we'll put a spiral bit in, we will plunge in, go over, plunge out. A spiral bit is really useful for this. Down cut if you want to keep the top cleaner, up cut if you want to keep the bottom cleaner, but that's a topic for a different video. Now for this demo, I'm not going to use this dust collection because it makes it very difficult to do. I do not like doing it, throws the balance off. So you're just going to have to trust me that this is terrible at collecting dust and try it for yourself. If you buy this, you will very quickly find that the space that this takes up in your shop is more valuable than the actual dust collection performance of this. So the way I like to do this is I like to first make sure I have these open the gap I want. If you're doing something relatively small, close them more. This is a Torx head screw. You can use a flat head, but it's a Torx to loosen these bolts. You loosen both of these, they just slide in and out. You can put them directly touching if you want, though I almost never do because of that little wiggle gap. So I'm going to set my router down roughly where I think the bit I want it to line up. I've got this unplugged the entire time. Just going to slide this in there. Then we're going to come down and we're just going to kind of eyeball this where we want it. Again, router is always unplugged during this. And we're just going to lock it in there and we can micro adjust our way to where we want to be. Now you have to be very careful when you're near an edge, as this will want to tip off. And that's why I built my little stand so that I can set this down off of the edge of the table. When I need to do anything else, I want to make sure that this is not going to fall off, so I have this little stand here. But for now, we're just aligning the edge guide. So I've got this locked in now. Now I'm real close, but I want to go over just a hair this way. So to do this, I'm going to make sure there's positive tension on here. I'm going to unlock this, and I'm going to go just a little bit to the left, and then I'm going to add a little positive tension back. So I'm going a little further than I want, pulling a little further back, then tightening a little bit to keep that positive tension, and I am then locking it in place, and I'm really happy with where that is. So at this point now, I've got my block here so I can set this down on, because this would fall right off the edge. I'm going to plug my router in, get your dust mask, all of that on. And one thing I've got here is I've got this little hook on the wall that I just loosely put this cord in, And that means when I'm routing, it's never in my way. It's not going to come under and get trapped or anything like that and damage the cord. Once you're at this point, you're going to want to obviously set your depth. Remember, if you've watched my other video, you set the bit down to the surface. Then you'll come along back here and either use a setup block or use these gradations of 1/8 of an inch to decide how deep you want to plunge on the surface. You lock this down, and then if I want to go 1/4 inch in, I just turn this over, and this can now plunge down 1/4 of an inch. Now, when doing any type of plunge cut, it's preferable not to take it all at once. If you're going only 1/4 inch or less, and it's not some kind of extremely hard exotic, you could take it all in one go. It leaves the cleanest edge taking it all in one go. If you want, you can pre-score these lines in marking gauge, and you can use a chisel just to pre-score the end of this so that there's no tear out. Decide if you want to do that. I don't really care what happens to this melamine, so I'm not going to bother with that, but there may be some tear out, chip out on this. And I'm going to align my bit with where I want at the very start of this on this end. And we're just going to turn it on, plunge down, make the cut. Remember, we're going to be applying pressure with where we're making contact. So for right now, this forward one is the only one making contact with this. I don't really have any of this back one making contact. So as I go forward, I'm going to need to make sure my pressure is here and not on the back here. And eventually they will both engage. But as I get to the front, I will lose some contact on that front, and I don't want to let it tip in. So my pressure will now be somewhat on the back here so that I'm not ruining my cut at all. And as you can see, I've got a really nice cut here. Our box joints are going to be totally fine. I've got the exit and the entrance. Surprisingly, no tear out. This is a super dull router bit. And then you would use the micro adjust from here, turning it to the right if you want to go forward, turning it to the left if you want to come back. And that really is how I use the edge guide the most. You could do a larger rabbet if you wanted some kind of giant rabbet that a normal router bit wouldn't do normally, and you didn't want to use the table saw. You start at 0 and go in. There are lots of different uses for this, but for me, it's mainly this stopped groove. Now you can see from this table here why the dust collection is useless. I've got dust back here. I've got dust over here. There's no way on heaven and earth that small of a port is going to catch dust that is being thrown away from the router. It does not work. You would somehow need all of the dust to be only going this way and extremely close, but this is just a messy task. For the circle cutting demo, I don't have a giant piece of wood to cut out of, nor the money to spend on that, so we're going to cut out of this shelf from an old shoe rack kind of thing. And I've got a bit of a janky setup here, but this is essentially just to hold this here for this photo. So what we've got is the centerpiece held down by a decent amount of duct tape, which really is kind of the only way to not put any holes or try to drive a screw through or anything like that. This is one of the downsides of this, and I've not found any other information suggesting there is a better way to do this. So I'm just going to cut a circle out of here. I've placed a little bit under just to make sure that I don't go all the way to my table, but that shouldn't be a problem. And you know, I hope this doesn't move, but it would be a bit fitting for this video if this center were to move at all and show the many problems with this circle cutting jig. In the description, I'm going to link some actual circle cutting jigs, some specific made ones. So if you're looking to cut out a tabletop or something like that and you can't afford to have any problems, I'm going to link a couple of them down there because I would highly suggest an actual circle cutting jig. This is a nice little add-on if you're going to use it once in a while, but it's not a great setup. Now, I'm also using a spiral bit so that I can plunge down and through. If you're using a straight bit, you're going to have to somehow drill an entry hole, but that's probably going to get inside of your circle. You really need some kind of spiral bit to plunge down through this. Now, there are a couple things to note here. You can take this in multiple passes if you want. Part of the problem of this not being 100% stable is if you take it in multiple passes and you have any room at all, it's not going to be perfect. I also would suggest dealing with the cord, if possible, putting it up over your shoulder and then feeding it behind you. That will keep it out of the way as we rotate this, because this will want to rotate around the power cord as well. However, if it's up over your shoulder with just a little slack, it can rotate around no problem. If you're in a tight area, I also suggest playing with how these bars are positioned so that you can avoid hitting anything. You can see because I have certain clamps, I've positioned more of this bar towards the back so that I can clear them all. Just some things to think about doing a dry run before you actually start cutting and run into a clamp. Another thing to look out for and to be helpful for is tear out on the bottom. If you're floating this over an empty space, you may get some tear out, and also be aware that once that circle is cut out, it's going to want to drop if you don't have it sitting on something else. The foam that people use for track saws to cut in the garage floor can be very useful for this. Gives you a wide surface to set it on top of, but just be prepared when you finally finish that cut. It's going to want to drop the middle out because there would be nothing holding it if you were just floating this over a table. But as you can see, I've put something underneath it to help. All right, and that was actually a pretty good result. We've got a nice circle cut out of there. I can feel one little spot here. You can't really see it where this centerpiece, you can see a little wiggle in there, likely moved just a hair. You also have to be careful when you're plunging to be really sure you're straight up and down. You can see probably that on camera, that little bit of play. It's not terrible, and I got a really good result this time. Like I said, for occasional use, it's okay. If you're going to use it a lot, you're eventually going to run into a problem. This is eventually going to come loose. Something's going to go wrong. And the one upside of this method that isn't usually touched on is that it doesn't put any sort of hole inside of this. That is the one reason to use this instead of an actual circle cutting jig, most of which use something driven into the underside of your project. If you need a circle that is perfectly clean on both sides, this will not leave a hole. Positives, negatives, I still think that if you are okay with a slight hole in the bottom, the negatives of this significantly outweigh the positives due to the possibility of error at any given moment from this slipping. And that's going to do it for today for the Bosch Edge Guide Circle Cutter, the RA1054 Deluxe Router Guide. Comes with the edge, the circle cutter, the dust collection chute, useless, and the pivot point for your circle. As I said at the beginning, this is a 7 out of 10 for me. It's $35. It does, for the most part, what I use it mainly for. If there was a significant upgrade aftermarket, I would be willing to spend $100, $150 on something if it solved all of the issues that I have with this one. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, something you want to add with your experiences with this, please leave it below. And thank you for joining me today. Feel free to subscribe or don't. Do whatever you want. Thank you. Have a good one.